Introduction, and then Mary can introduce herself. We're excited to be here. I know it's like a small group, but I think that we can have a little bit more of a conversation if folks would like to. Feel free to ask questions as we go, either in the chat box or even just unmuting yourself. I think, we're happy to hear from you all. As Rachel said, I'm Laila Hlass. I'm a law professor here at Tulane. I teach immigration law. I teach in our experiential curriculum, which is when students are actually practicing law in order to learn. So they're in clinics and things we call externships, and also simulation courses. And I've practiced and taught immigration law for more than a decade. Here in Louisiana, I've also practiced in other areas too, DC, New York, Boston, but I'm really happy to be here. I grew up about an hour from New Orleans, so always happy to be home. Yeah, I'll turn it over to my colleague to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Great to meet you all. My name is Mary Yanik. I just joined Tulane Law's faculty in the summer because we founded this Immigrant Rights Clinic focusing on detained representation then. So I'm very excited to be in this new position. I've been in New Orleans since 2015, and I first came here to work for the New Orleans Worker Center for Racial Justice. So I've been doing this work with immigrant communities, doing legal work in support of organizing, representing folks who are day laborers, immigrant workers, victims of trafficking, as well as those who are detained, and pursuing federal constitutional rights claims in federal court, as well as immigration representation. So super excited to talk to you about this really pressing crisis today.
So we thought we would, since it's a really small group, we thought we might do introductions if people feel like they can either type in the chat box or just unmute themselves and just say your name, maybe what you'd like to hear about. And then I thought as an icebreaker, we could just say one of our favorite places in New Orleans. Charlotte, can I call on you? Can you either unmute or write in the chat box? Do you know how? Let me see if I can take this. If your mic's not working, it's okay too.
Mute. Okay. Good?
Yeah.
My name is Charlotte Cooksey. I'm retired judge. I grew up in New Orleans, but spent much of my adult life in Baltimore. And I've come back to New Orleans. Immigration is a topic that I'm very interested in. I don't have any experience with it other than listening to discussions, but it is an interest of mine. As a judge, I was very involved with marginalized individuals and creating programs for them. And so immigration has become a retirement focus.
That's great to hear. How have you done any volunteering or otherwise been involved or just kind of talking to people?
No, other than another retirement goal is I'm trying to learn Spanish.
Oh, great.
So I've been taking Spanish classes.
That's great to hear. I've been spending time in the pandemic on Duolingo, practicing French because my daughter is in French immersion school, so I'm trying to learn something.
It's fun, Duolingo.
Yeah, that's great. Could I call on, is it Sandra?
Yes, I'm Rachel's mother. Hi. Don't ask me to do anything on the computer because I'll just lose myself forever.
Is there anything you'd like to hear about, or?
You know what? I'm not actually haven't ever been totally involved in any aspects of immigration. Even though I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, we had a lot of people coming in. I was never aware of any problems or anything regarding immigration. So I'm all open to hear what's happening today. I know today it's a critical critical,
in the
important.
school, when you
important.
worked as a teacher, Mom, did you deal with any, you dealt with a lot of difficult kids. My mom was a special ed teacher and a speech pathologist in the school system.
You know, Rachel, I really didn't have that population. I didn't teach in that population at all, even though we taught people, you know, people who came here from other countries. It was all countries that it was legal migration, not immigration, you know, nothing aside from being legal. Yeah, no, I haven't been exposed to anything.
Yeah, and the interesting thing too is sometimes there are a lot of issues with kids who are coming to the U.S. without without like a legal framework getting into schools. I've worked with a lot of young people who like aren't sure how to access the school. The schools are really asking them for things that aren't required in order to register, and so there really are a lot of obstacles to that. Jacqueline, could we call on you?
Yes, I want you to know just how interested I am in both of you speaking, that I broke my wrist Saturday night and I have this enormous cast and about to go to surgery this afternoon, I think. So the fact that I'm here says much. So I am a special ed, elementary ed teacher also, and I too have not had kids in that arena. But I'm also in a book group of a lot of Jewish women in the community. And the book we just read was American Dirt, which is very controversial. And I actually understand the controversy, but my feeling is that I learned so much from what the novel was about migrants trying to get away and trying to get into the United States. And it really touched a nerve for me. And I have done something with the church on Canal and Jeff Davis. There's a church that has been involved. And so I was attending some of their meetings about this. And I'm looking for a way to get involved and to learn more.
Wonderful. Well, we're really thrilled to have you here, and really hope you have a smooth recovery. This can be so painful and annoying, and we're very honored that you came.
And can I just add one thing? At noon, I have to get off because I'm on a committee for the JCC, and that meeting starts at noon.
Yeah, and we'll be, I think, planning to wrap up right at noon as well, but if leaving a few minutes early, absolutely. Okay. Thanks. Phyllis, can I call on you if your sound is working?
Can you unmute yourself, Phyllis?
Yeah.
Oh,
okay. I'm Phyllis Lubier. I am a child of two immigrants who came here. My mother came here in 1927, I believe. And it was quite different at that time. She had to be under the guidance of her uncle. And that when the thing is, they all lived in like a ghetto, right? All the Jewish people who came in at that time only associated with Jewish people, and that unless they went to work. And then she had to go to South America to bring my father here, to get married and bring him here. Going through, the problems they had are quite different than the people nowadays coming into this country. Going through, they were adults, they were working, and then she brought a brother and a sister over, and they had a small nucleus. Went to school here right away, evening school, and that had a practice of learning the language. One wanted to learn the language. We have a problem now with a lot of immigrants who don't go into and learn the language, so they are much more isolated. I was brought up on all the problems as immigrants when they came here, getting apartments, locating in different areas, set up, and the closest they had a society of people who came from their place in Poland. It was Austria where my mother was born, but it became Poland. And that they were cliquish in that respect going through. Then because they had a grocery store, they had to get into dealing with all people. And that broke the ice for them. And I think that's one of the things that immigrants coming into this country now have to do too. And it's quite different, especially with the president we have. And I know the problems arising from it. But each group has had a problem when they first came in. We talk about the Irish, the Polish, the Italians, wherever they were people that everyone looked down on because they were immigrants. And I guess that's what's happening now, but everyone's making a fuss and not allowing them to assimilate into the country as such, which is something. I belong to the group that meets the Mexicans coming in on the bus station and tries to give them
Nola Grannies.
The
Nola Grannies, you've been volunteering for them.
there. And basically they talk their language, not trying to train them to learn ours. And I think that's one of the biggest costs, let alone a difference in skin complexion going through. But I think our government has gotten just impossible dealing with people coming in and making it very, very hard. They will use them to work, but not to give them the security of belonging.
That's
And
such
that
an,
Yeah.
I was going to say that's such an important point. It reminds me of an article I read that started off like I think it was we wanted workers, but people came, you know, and just
it's
but
like
I really appreciate too you talking about kind of the cyclical nature of migration and how different we've seen migration from particular countries at different points, high points and low points. But a lot of the problems remain the same in terms of challenges that people face when they first get here.
it's not only here. My father had to leave Poland and he went to Germany first. And he then had a choice either going to Israel or to Switzerland. And he didn't want to go to Switzerland, and Israel couldn't accept him. His brother went there, but not him. So he ended up going to Montevideo. And my mother and father knew each other from childhood. So she went down there. She became American citizen. She got in here because she was sponsored by an uncle. And she became an American citizen right away. And then she went to Montevideo to marry him and bring him here. At that time, if you got married, you could come here on your spouse's passport. Now they don't even allow that.
Yeah, that's changed quite a bit. And one of the things too that's changed quite a bit that we're going to talk about in a minute, I'm going to ask a couple more people to introduce themselves, but is the scope of detention. And so that didn't really exist in earlier decades, you know, in the 80s, you know, you're talking about like dozens of people.
Well, no, yeah,
being
Parents.
detained in the United States upon immigrating here. And today what we're really going to talk about is the tens of thousands of people who are being held in detention centers and the challenges they face. I'm going to ask now if Carol is there and wants to say a word to introduce herself. And then I see Linda and Patricia as well.
I don't, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
All right. Let's see. I'm from actually originally from Chicago, and my parents were born in this country. My grandparents were born in Holland, but my grandparents on the other side were from here. So I come from not as much of an immigrant background, but I have a housekeeper who's been with me for 50 years, and she came from Belize. And it took a long time to be able to get her a citizenship here. So I've seen some of the struggle of trying to get people into this country. Not easy. I think that's about it.
Thanks so much, Carol. I appreciate that insight. And Linda, are you there? For sure. You're able to unmute?
Can you unmute your device, Linda? All right, Trish, what about you? Trish, can you unmute and just give us a background on your experience with immigrants?
Oh, we can keep going too if people want to say hello or type a question at any time in the chat box, they can as well. Well, we really appreciate getting that insight and getting a sense of of what people's experiences are, and that they don't not everyone has a lot of experiences in the immigration system. So today we want to talk a little bit about the expansion of detention in Louisiana, but also that's just like one part of a really big picture that we're going to talk about nationally, what's happening and why these jails are sprouting up and filling up with immigrants. We also are going to just hear about how people get detained, like why that happens, how that happens, and then what are the problems once people are in detention? What are they facing? You may have seen some of these stories in the news. And we then want to talk about the question that several of you raised is like, and what Jacqueline was saying, how can I help? How can I be more involved? So we'll talk about the work that we're doing at the Immigration Clinic, as well as some of our partner groups and the ways that people can volunteer. So I want to start talking about, we can move to the next slide, and then the one after that. I think before we go into, Mary's going to talk about kind of like this growing problem of expansion and of detention. But before we start, I wanted to start with a story of someone that we were working with recently who was detained, because I think his story really tells us a lot about the immigrant detention problem that we see. So the Southern Poverty Law Center has an immigrant justice project, and they have something called the Southeast Immigrant Freedom Initiative, where they match attorneys with immigrants who need lawyers. And they connected our law clinic with a man named Luis this fall in our first semester of opening. He had been detained when we met him for about 10 months. And we had 2 students working with him. He had fled political persecution and he was seeking asylum, but he had been ordered deported by an immigration judge while he was in detention. He had represented himself in his hearing because immigrants don't have a right under the statutes to having a lawyer appointed to them in immigration court, like what happens in the criminal system, right? And so like most asylum seekers and most immigrants representing themselves, especially those who are detained, he lost his case. It's what happens in the vast majority of cases where people are representing themselves in detention. And so when we took his I'll call it his custody case, but the case which involves like whether or not he has to be in detention, he was still fighting for asylum on appeal, so he could ask for different, the appellate judge body for immigration to take a second look at that case. He had already been denied what we call parole, but just another way of asking to get out of detention. And all he really wanted, like what he wanted every minute of every day of every hour that he was in detention, was to be with his wife, who he called the heir of life, and his son, who were living in Texas. His wife was about to apply for her green card, and his son was granted asylum. But he had, you know, and they had different fates because they were in before different judges, and so you know, really wildly different outcomes. Some of my colleagues at Georgetown Law School call it refugee roulette, because the disparities between who is granted asylum and who is not are just so wildly different. And it's not because of the strength of the cases, but because, you know, what a difference it makes to have an attorney and to be able to have to represent yourselves and the different rates of granting in different courtrooms. The conditions were very hard for Luis in detention. Like all detainees, he had almost no access to outdoors. You get about an hour out of 24 hours of the day. The food is substandard, and when detainees speak out, they're often met with harsh consequences. And his health was deteriorating. At one point, he collapsed. He lost consciousness outside and was rushed to emergency medical care. Our students later got his medical records, and they realized that months before, when this happened, the doctor said he needs to see a cardiologist within 24 hours. This is an emergency, and that never happened. The condition put his life in danger, and it made him more susceptible to death if he contracted COVID. And he had come into contact with COVID positive individuals while in detention. I'm sure you've seen many articles about how COVID has been spreading in our detention centers and jails. It's like wildfire, and they just don't have, detainees don't have what they need to keep themselves safe. They can't force themselves to be distanced from others, and they don't have the equipment. But with our students' amazing advocacy and some luck, we were able to win release for Luis. He's now with his family. He's trying to build his life back. He's going to be able to apply for his green card, and eventually he could be eligible for citizenship. And I think this story, I'm like glad to give you guys some good news. You know, we had like a happy ending in this story. But I think the challenges he faced are really illustrative of what's happening in detention. You know, one of the lessons is like what a difference a lawyer can make to someone being able to win their case, being able to get out of detention. It's virtually impossible to win on your own. It's complicated to win an asylum case, you know, which he lost on his own. It involves completing all sorts of complicated immigration forms, collecting evidence, testimony, and you have to prove like a legal theory. The standard isn't relaxed just because you're representing yourself. There are all sorts of other challenges that detained people may be facing: poor medical care, substandard food, retaliation for speaking up against things that are happening, as well as just the increased risk of getting COVID, and then, you know, combined with some people's medical conditions, just you know, terrible health outcomes. It's no surprise we've seen an increase in the number of of deaths in immigrant detention this year. A big increase already, and a third of those who died tested positive for COVID. There was also someone who took their life. We've seen that happening. There just aren't protections for those who have mental health problems, and certainly being in detention can worsen what it's like for people. So I'm going to turn it over. That's kind of a story that shows some of the problems, but to talk about just, you know, the numbers and what we're seeing, I'm going to turn it over to Mary to talk about the expansion of detention.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to briefly review why this has become such a profound problem in Louisiana. As you all know, we're not a traditional border state. We're not near the southern border where we know lots of immigrants are coming into the country. But we are in a huge crisis with thousands of detained immigrants here. And that has been new. There's been astronomical increases over the past few years. So this just brief national map shows the growth of detention centers and the current status of those detention centers. You see a lot of county or city facilities that are being contracted to detain immigrants. Those are primarily jails and prisons that usually hold people who are convicted of crimes. And you also see there's a lot of privately operated facilities. That's corporations that are setting up these facilities to hold immigrants who largely came here to seek asylum. Then moving in more specifically to focus on Louisiana, over the past 4 years, these are all of the new facilities that have opened up, and the size of the dot matches how many new beds. So you see there are some facilities in Texas, there's that facility in Arizona, and then you see a lot of large red dots in Louisiana because that's where overwhelmingly the expansion of immigration detention has happened over the past few years. Here's a map. This is from 2019, so it's not exactly up to date, but this shows where the new facilities in Louisiana have been located, and that they've overwhelmingly been in northern and central Louisiana. So, you know, I'm sure many of you have lived here for decades. You know that these areas are comparatively pretty remote. These are far out, smaller towns that, as you can see from here, started suddenly detaining oftentimes 1,000 or more detained immigrants, facilities that did not used to house any immigrants at all. And then again, this also shows the two blue dots are the two sort of long-standing immigration detention mega complexes, Gina and Pine Prairie. All of the green dots are these new facilities. Again, they're very far away from New Orleans, which is where the vast majority of immigration lawyers and immigration service providers live and work. And so all these facilities are very far from help that people need when they're being detained.
Oh my God.
And then of course, everyone knows that immigration enforcement has increased very starkly under the current administration. But there's another element of the story that explains why immigrants are specifically being held in Louisiana. And that's that over the same period that the federal government massively increased their immigration enforcement and started holding people without the same opportunities for release, Louisiana started to decarcerate. Louisiana statewide, a bipartisan coalition passed the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which reduced incarceration, released state inmates from jails under the theory that we should not incarcerate more people than any other state. And instead of spending money on incarceration of prisoners, we should put that money into social services to prevent people from reoffending. So that movement happened over these 2 years, and over 4,000 people were released, or there also were not the same sort of new incarcerations, trying to reduce overall incarceration. And then those beds were empty in these local facilities, and people had already built the infrastructure for mass detention and mass incarceration. And so federal immigration authorities moved in to sign highly lucrative contracts that offered up to $65 a day for the detention of migrants. And these local officials jumped at the opportunity to fill those beds. So what we see is this really unfortunate confluence of factors that even when our state was trying to make a deliberate humanitarian decision to sort of do better and invest in people and not in incarceration, unfortunately, the federal immigration enforcement complex really undermined that push and led to those facilities being filled with immigrants. But we also want to highlight that this isn't a problem that is entirely unique over the past 4 years. Detention has grown for many years, including during the Obama administration. And so while some of the inhumanity and some of the, explicitly racist rhetoric out of the administration is unprecedented, a lot of the groundwork for this detention and deportation pipeline was built under the Obama and Biden administrations. So this chart shows the total apprehensions at the border over the different years. And you can see that, that 2014 actually has this huge spike. And there are detention sort of flows, and there were a lot of people coming in when Obama was president as well, and many of them were detained. And while the specific family separation crisis happened over Trump, Obama actually started family detention, which was detaining usually mothers with their minor children in these family detention facilities in Southern Texas before they made it through sort of the first round of immigration processing to get the right to seek asylum. So those family detention complexes had been open long before Trump, and families had been separated in other ways even before Trump. And we saw, even though many were hopeful there would be real changes to dismantle the system, a setting up for the expansion that we saw under an administration that really went after immigrants and went after immigrant communities. So that's how we came to house right now more immigrants that are in detention centers than any other state save Texas. And while the overall numbers that are housed in Louisiana have decreased overall, and nationally, there have been some releases given COVID. There still are thousands of people that are held in our state, many of whom arrived at the southern border requesting asylum, and then have been detained for the entirety of their processing time, trying to seek that protection from fleeing violence in their home country. Next, I'll turn it back over to Laila to talk about some of the detention conditions.
Yeah. Unfortunately, despite this huge explosion of immigrant detention that we've seen over the last couple decades, there's no enforceable standards regarding detention conditions. And the detaining is happening in all sorts of different places. This is a picture, I believe, of LaSalle detention facility, which is kind of managed by the GEO group. There are these private facilities, privately run facilities. There's localities that own facilities. There's federal prisoner facilities, so the same jails that federal prisoners are in, immigrants are being detained in. So it's a whole kind of mix of places and no enforceable standards. And so just as a result, there's substandard medical treatment, mental health care. People don't have access to religious services, access to telephones, access to libraries, access to attorneys. In fact, people face at times physical abuse, retaliation, and excessive use of segregation when they try to speak up. I had a client years ago who was actually being sexually abused by one of the guards at LaSalle, and being put in solitary, and it just worsened her ability to get help, to report what was going on because she was so isolated. And in fact, when she was before a judge in Oakdale, the judge said, this was before we met her, but I heard the recordings at a later date. The judge was conducting mass hearings. So asking 50 people in a room, does everyone understand their legal rights? And you hear muffled voices, and then an interpreter says, "See," and then the judge says, "Yes, by all," on the record. And then after kind of this massive running of rights, the judge asked individual people a couple of questions, and he asks her, "Are you afraid to go back to your home country?" She said, "I'm not that afraid of my home country. I'm afraid of what's happening to me here now." The judge yells at her, "I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid of going back to your home country?" And so he wouldn't even let her say what she wanted to say, which was what was happening to her in that moment. Instead, he ordered her deported in that same few minutes of hearing. So, things like that happen in detention, and people are so geographically isolated from where the kind of concentration of attorneys are. They're here in New Orleans, immigration attorneys, and in Baton Rouge mostly. There's some spread out throughout the state, but all these detention centers are in central and northern Louisiana, hours and hours away from where the large numbers of attorneys are. And so people can face a lack of protection from violence in those facilities. There aren't accommodations. I've worked with transgendered people. There are elderly people who aren't given what they need in detention. There's failure to have edible food. People sometimes get sick from the food, and then people have protested, and then they get put in solitary for raising their voices. People have limited means to make grievances for problems, but they often find that they have no remedies. Some of you may have seen in the news this story of forced hysterectomies that was happening in Georgia. There was a whistleblower, a nurse, who reported this, and there's been a lot of news coverage and congressional hearings where women were alleging that there were mass hysterectomies happening without consent. They did not understand what was happening. And it's shocking, but this is an example of the kind of medical mistreatment that we are seeing in detention centers. And if people don't have access to attorneys or to whistleblowers, to others, if they're geographically isolated, it makes it so much harder for them to exercise their rights. I think maybe we'll go to the next slide. I mean, one of the other issues that we see is that the geographic isolation leads to it being much harder to access attorneys. So this is a graph that shows that what representation rates are like. And so people who are not detained, 66% of them end up getting attorneys. Those might be private attorneys. Sometimes people pool all of their resources and family resources to be able to pay for an attorney. Sometimes these are nonprofits. Sometimes these are private attorneys doing pro bono work, but 66% are represented. Detained people, 14%. And we see lower rates than that in the detention centers here in Louisiana. And then if you look at the next slide, you see it really matters if you're detained or not. So the dark blue is people who are represented, and the light blue is people who are unrepresented. And it's how many people are winning their cases. And so you see that for detained people, only 2% of unrepresented detained people win their cases. That is not because they do not have a case. 98% do not have a case, okay? It's completely not feasible for people to try to put forth their cases on their own without access to, very good libraries, without access to materials in their own language. And figure out the law and then pull together the evidence all while in detention, right? If you're released from detention, you have a better shot of winning your case. Pro se people representing themselves released, 7% from 2% win their cases, still shockingly low. But if they're represented, that's almost 40% of them are winning their cases once they're represented and released. And then if they've never been detained, even higher outcomes. 60% of represented people who have never been detained are winning their cases. And then you see even the pro se numbers are higher because you have more time, you have ability to learn things and figure out and try to build a case. So it's just vastly stark. I'm going to end there and turn it over to Mary to talk a little bit about the deportation pipeline and how you can help. But if you have questions, we'll have a couple minutes at the end.
We just wanted to take a minute to reflect on how people end up in this system and talk about the different sort of paths and what happens that leads to someone being detained. So this is a chart of deportations from Louisiana over the years. You can see that there was a huge spike 2010 to 2014, and then again this huge spike 2018 to 2020. And overwhelmingly, most of those deportations out of Louisiana are from the detention centers here. People being directly put on a plane, put on ICE air, and then being forcibly deported to the country that they originated from. And so there's a few different sources of how people wind up in detention. There's a fair amount of arrests at the border by border officials, and that certainly has increased the more we militarize and surveil the border, which is creating a human rights crisis because of the desert, lack of water, and just the extremely difficult things people go through to get into this country. There's been a huge expansion of the sort of detention throughout someone's case for people who request asylum at the border. So that's someone who did not try to surreptitiously pass through an entry point or cross the river. It's someone who arrived at the border, waited in a line, and said, I want to request asylum. Those people used to have more avenues for release, and now they are almost entirely detained for the entire life of their case, leading to worse outcomes and the huge explosion in people who are in detention. That's recently somewhat changed from the really inhumane policy of trying to make people wait in Mexico while they're trying to mount and explain their asylum case and get a lawyer and get evidence. But that has, over the past few years overall, a lot of the people that have been detained in Louisiana have been people who showed up and tried to get an asylum hearing and were shipped here for months or even years. There's also ICE arrests and raids. That's people in our community, our neighbors, who are facing arrests and raids from ICE. That can happen at workplaces. It can happen on the streets. And then this last bucket is really huge and not often understood by the general population, that local law enforcement is a huge source of people that end up in detention and therefore possibly deported. And that's that in a lawsuit in New York, ICE recently said that 88% of those who were detained in New York were detained after a local law enforcement interaction. This is a fact that ICE likes to tout because they say that they're deporting quote unquote criminals. But when you actually look at the statistic, it's overwhelmingly people who have had traffic stops, extremely minor offenses. And so for people who are undocumented, especially under this regime, even getting stopped for speeding risks your life. It risks putting you in these detention facilities for years while you try to fight your case because of how many local jurisdictions will pass information and detain and transfer someone to immigration, even if they're not ultimately convicted of whatever they're accused for. There are limits on that in Orleans Parish, but even just outside in Kenner and Jefferson Parish, any of those interactions with authorities are very high risk for people who have even been here for decades. And then I really quickly wanted to tell the story of the Hard Rock whistleblower because it shows the stakes of immigration enforcement for all of us, not just us as New Orleans residents, but even as people committed to public safety. I represented the whistleblower Joel Ramirez Palma, who spoke out to OSHA and even before the building collapse had said on several occasions the building was not level and he was concerned. His supervisor threatened him and told him if he didn't like the job, he threatened to fire him because he continued to speak out about how the building was unsafe. And he unfortunately A few days after the building collapsed, after he thankfully escaped with his life, he was arrested by Border Patrol officials while he was fishing. And Fish and Wildlife had called Border Patrol officials to the scene under highly suspicious circumstances because of the fear that he was retaliated against, that they were trying to deport him, to deport the evidence of the company's wrongdoing. And this is a picture of his family who has lived here for decades. Ultimately, he was sadly deported, even though he gave 3 separate interviews to Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and that from what we can tell, the information that he gave them led them to cite multiple contractors for their health and safety violations. So essential witness to an investigation into a health and safety crisis that killed 3 workers and has continued to scar our city for months. And he was deported to Honduras. Even though he was essential to that investigation, we continue to represent him in his retaliation claim. Now we wanted to just talk about, with all of this crisis, what can we do as individuals to help? We're gonna go through a few organizations. There's so many good people working in this area. And if you have any money, time, skills to offer them, there's really anything you can do to help is really great to just be a part of this, including just continue to stay informed and talk to your friends and people in your life about how this affects everyone. So we are with the Tulane Immigrant Rights Clinic. This is a link to how to donate to our organization. We train students in this work and also represent detained immigrants. Another great organization that's trying to provide comprehensive legal services to those in several of these detention centers is ISLA, Immigration Services and Legal Advocacy. Some of you might have heard of their work. Migrant Freedom Home is a house that's out where those detention centers are located, that's both people running that are providing legal services and also helping pick people up when they're released, because they're just released from the facility, and then you need someone to pick them up and then help them go to the bus station or find a way to reconnect with their loved ones, a really essential service. Voces Unidas is a non-lawyer group that's collecting money, putting money in people's commissary. They do a lot of translations. They used to do a lot of rides. Depending on sort of the COVID situation, they might start doing that again if it becomes safe to do so, providing a lot of services. Advocates for Immigrant Rights is based in Memphis, also doing legal services, and SPLC, of course, is representing some detained immigrants. And then here's some other organizations that aren't specifically focused on detained, but also doing great work here that we just want you to know about. Familias Unidas en Acción. They've done a mass food distribution system to immigrant families who aren't eligible for unemployment insurance, who aren't getting any of the COVID relief. They take in money and then send out food packets to families during this time. ALAS helps immigrant and court-involved youth, connect them to lawyers, and then also help write them letters to assist their cases and organize teachers to become aware about these issues. The Cameroonian American Council is supporting a lot of Cameroonians who are fleeing violence in their country and seeking asylum. There's a large population of Cameroonians in the detention centers here. And then lastly, Project Ishmael is run out of that First Grace Methodist Church. There's a colleague, Angela, who takes kids' cases, trying to help them seek status, and they do really great work. So I know we only have a few minutes, but we'd love to hear people's questions, reflections, and thoughts. And I'm seeing there's something in the chat. Oh yeah, that's just Laila.
That's just me sending little links in the chat in case it was easier for
I have
people.
a question.
Please.
Yeah, the information you just posted about the local agencies, or can you email those to the people that are here?
We'd love to send you an email. I don't know if Rachel, I'm sorry, Rachel, if Rachel can send us people's emails, or we can send it to Rachel.
Okay. If you send it to Rachel, that would be great.
Sure.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, I was wondering about the private detention centers. It's my understanding that they're locally the contract's with the local government, not the state. And so going through the state to try to impact on these is sort of useless. Is that correct?
Sort of. There are, so, you know, in Louisiana, we sort of know the political environment we are in, which
Right.
means that there's private prisons everywhere. California at the state level has legislated to tightly restrict private prisons, including private immigration facilities. So there is state level authority to regulate it. I think that's sadly unlikely here. And that it really, it is more likely to advocate with some of these, you know, parish and local authorities who are contracting for the beds.
They pay more than the people were making before. The federal government pays more.
They pay way more than the
So
state.
the financial incentive is tremendous.
That's true. That's one of the challenges.
That's
to
very
practice.
sad because that doesn't look like a wonderful outcome.
Yeah, even with the local officials, it's a very difficult road ahead
Right.
to go back from this point once we're here.
Yeah.
Because it's local jobs for those people. It's you know, there's even stories, there's a story out of Alabama where local sheriff like pocketed the money for the food for the inmates. There's all sorts of you know, really concerning incentives for everyone who's involved in making these decisions.
Yeah.
Well, we see that we're out of time. We're so grateful for everyone to be here and participate, and we look forward to being in touch with you all. We'll make an email that Rachel can share, and you should feel free to reach out to us as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you all for all the good work you're doing.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting this together and sharing this information with us. It's just so critical and important in our community here to share this information. So thank you for coming.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.